So I grew up in just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and lived with my grandmother, who was had come to the United States from the Ukraine, Odessa, and settled here. Actually came through New York, and then traveled to Boston, where she met my grandfather, who, and then I wound up. My family wound up living with her after I was born after the war. I was born in 1946. And when my dad came home from the war, they were living, my parents and I and my older brother were living with my grandmother in Dorchester, Massachusetts. And my grandmother was an Orthodox Jew. She'd come over with her little brother, who was 9 at the time, and she was 13 years old, and they came by themselves. And she was asked to do that by her family, to take her younger brother, who was 9, to the United States so he would be safe from the Tsar's army. And I mean, every time I think about that, every time I tell that story, I can't imagine myself or any of us doing that at 13, right? And knowing you'd probably never see your family again. And so you can imagine what an impact that had on her as a young girl. And she became the early matriarch of the family, of traditions and holding the family together. And she was powerful in that way and had a huge influence on me. And she believed in community and about taking care of others, and traditions, and being generous and kind. She could be incredibly stubborn all at the same time. And I think people say the same things about me. So she was sort of like my guiding star in a way. And I didn't really know it. It's not like sometimes you know those things. It's not really conscious. And so I was just going to go on with the story. So fast forward to when I realized I was a lesbian. So I decided that I had to live somewhere else rather than in the Boston area because my family, I'd come out to my father when I was a teenager, and in those days it was in the early 1960s, and it was like, oh my gosh, you know, I told him thought I was a lesbian, and he didn't know what to do to help me. He wanted to help me. He was my grandmother's son, so his first instinct was not, you can't be that or you need to leave. It was like, how can he help me? And there wasn't any real way to help in those days. There wasn't anybody to talk to. There weren't any books to read. And so his first thought was I should go to a therapist and maybe they could change me, help me. And which of course, when he said that to me, I immediately freaked out because I thought, well, I can't have that kind of diagnosis follow me for the rest of my life. What would happen to me being labeled and diagnosed as a lesbian? So I went to see this therapist for a couple of sessions until my father got so frustrated. He said, well, what's happening? And finally I said, well, I'm cured, I'm better, everything's fine. But in my head and in my heart, that's when I realized I had to leave home. So I'm standing in line at the Castro, and it's a beautiful sunny day. And everybody's my age, like we're in our 20s and early 30s, and we're all looking, beautiful in our 20s and 30s. With short sleeve t-shirts, and everybody was like having a great time. And I looked around and I thought, oh my God, everybody's the same. They're all young. And did you ever get struck by something that just struck you clear from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet. It was visceral. It wasn't just a thought. And I said, where are they? Where are our elders? What happened to them? Was there some kind of Holocaust? So I didn't know what to do with that feeling. I didn't know what to do with that thought. But I knew that I would never forget it, and I never did. It stayed with me forever. And it really was, it guided me. Because I wanted to have older folks in my life. I wanted to live in an intergenerational community. See, we were building community then. It didn't exist before in the way that we were thinking of it. We had no institutions to speak of, like healthcare centers or mental health centers. All those things we would build them. My generation would build them. And and all of that comes from living, I think, in knowing and loving my grandmother and understanding her life, listening to her wisdom, watching her stubbornness, and wanting to, as a young lesbian, to have older LGBT folks in my life to learn from. And just to interact with and engage with. And so it really set me on a course. I was already on the course of being a student, studying to be a psychotherapist. But in the back of my mind always was, how can I have older folks in my life? How can I help create an intergenerational community? And it was the dot-com period in San Francisco. And that was one of the times when, we've seen many of these here in San Francisco, where the rents start to escalate because all these tech people are moving in and all these seniors are being evicted and forced to leave the city. And so what was happening in San Francisco at that time was a lot of the people of that generation that had built the community we were living in, the LGBT folks, were being forced out of their apartments and forced to leave. Seniors of all kinds were being forced out of the city. But it was particularly hard for LGBT seniors because they didn't know where they could go to feel safe or be safe, where they could be out again. And there weren't a lot of places where they could go. And so it was a very frightening time. And so I was out for a walk one day with a friend, and we were talking about this situation, and I said, well, somebody needs to do something about this. We need to keep these people here. We need to keep them where they're safe, where they're a part of our community. And she said, well, why don't you do that? So I said, yeah, I will. So I went home. I was living with my then partner, Jeanette, and I said to her, I walked in the door and I said, I'm going to build LGBT senior housing, I said, with services. And she looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, do you want to join me? So that's how it started.
One of the themes in my life is that I always believed that I could make things happen. That also carried me through some of the hardest times in my life, such as when I lost Jeanette, and a sense that I could get through it. Sometimes life comes in, it's not your own doing, it's nothing you did. It's just life will come in and just upend you. I think it made me a deeper person. I'd had compassion before, of course, for people who had experienced difficult things. But an experience like that really throws you up and you wind up in a million pieces, and then you have to kind of put yourself back together again, and you never put yourself back together in quite the same way. as you move through grief, I began to realize that wherever I went, there she was, that she would always be in my heart.